Hello, my name is Kiara and I'm with the Watershed Center, and today I'll be walking you through part 3 of our water quality investigation lesson plan focusing on data analysis. So I'm going to share my screen with the lesson plan, and it might look slightly different than when you're accessing this, depending on whether we make some small updates or not, but the whole flow should stay pretty consistent. So for this lesson, we are looking at the data that we collected in the field. So this lesson happens after the field day. Students have collected data on turbidity, pH, nitrate, and dissolved oxygen. And we are now looking at those data. They're finally finding out the results, and they're thinking about what that tells us about local water quality. This also is set up to a data share day with another class or with another school. If you choose to do that, that part is optional. But this also touches on developing some questions that students could ask the other classroom or school that collects data to kind of understand where there might be differences between what they found and what the other school or classroom found. So today we're also going to be talking about thresholds and the kind of lower threshold, the upper threshold that certain data should be within in order to indicate a healthy system. So this timeline is the same length as the other lessons, and it's pretty quick. So this lesson bops pretty quickly between what data do we find, what does that tell us, and is a lot of kind of group discussion. For some students who might have already had a lot of experience talking about specific water quality indicators, this could be more independent in terms of having small group discussions or even individual thinking. But in my experience teaching this, we've found that kind of that larger group discussion paired with some opportunities for small group discussion is the most valuable way to do this. Another component to this for pre-event prep is that you'll need the class average for each water quality indicator. So this is just for the data that your class collected. And we do have an optional template if you'd like to calculate those averages, and that's here. You would just enter, this is here so that in case there's a second classroom or school, you're able to distinguish the data between the two. Here we have date that the data were collected on, and then each row would be one data sheet that the students collected in the field. So you would enter the dissolved oxygen, nitrate, turbidity, and pH from each of those data sheets onto an individual row, and then that will auto-populate your averages for the classroom. So for example, I could do 3, 6, 25, and 8, 5, 8, 20, and 6. And it'll auto calculate those averages and then display them on a graph as well. So the first question that we'd get into with students in a large group discussion is just a reminder of what data we collected. So this is dissolved oxygen, turbidity, nitrate, and pH. And we want to also remember and use this time to remind students what each indicator tells us about water quality. So what does turbidity tell us? Why do we measure it? What does nitrate tell us? And then we're going to go into the what did we find? So this is the component where we're handing out a worksheet for students to complete. Typically, I'll be at the front of the class walking through this environmental thresholds graph with a projector, and then students fill it out alongside me while discussing the findings as a group. The way, before kind of going into this, the way that I have personally kind of taught about thresholds is using chocolate as a kind of way to metaphor of how to talk about it. So saying, my lower threshold for the amount of chocolate I eat each day is 2 pieces of chocolate. If I don't get 2 pieces of chocolate, then I'm sad. But I also have an upper threshold where if I eat too much chocolate, my stomach hurts. And so I don't want to eat more than a bar of chocolate. So then I ask students, based on that, how much chocolate do I need to eat in a day to be in my healthy range between lower and upper thresholds? I need to eat between 2 pieces of chocolate and and whatever I said before for my upper threshold, a bar of chocolate each day. And if I have more than that or less than that, then I won't be happy for whatever reason. So kind of touching on the thresholds before we start getting into the data for each indicator. And then I'm going to scroll down to the worksheet that you'll complete with students. So this is the worksheet that you'll hand out during class. This is the section of what did we find. So students will put their name, and then for this section, or for this day rather, they only have their own classes data. So there is a spot for the another class or another school to fill out upstream or downstream. But that can be done at the data share day once they've heard from the other students what the other schools or classrooms results were. And so here we have dissolved oxygen, and then we have this kind of cheat sheet to which end of the y-axis is more oxygen versus less oxygen. And then students will fill in, basically make a bar graph for their data. So let's say that the students were on the upstream data side, they would make a bar graph here with their result. And they would write the actual number, the class average here. So for example, I would say, all right, we found a dissolved oxygen of 4 parts per million. Students would draw up to the 4 here, and they would write 4 parts per million here. And then we would talk about this lower threshold. So did we meet the lower threshold? And so if we're below this number, 6 in this case, that means that there is not necessarily enough dissolved oxygen in that creek at the time of sampling compared to what the ideal level of dissolved oxygen might be. And so in that case, we talk about, later we'll talk about what are some ways that we could increase the amount of dissolved oxygen in that creek. If it's over that, for ones that only have a lower threshold, that's totally fine. There's really just a minimum, not a maximum, for the amount of dissolved oxygen that you'd want to have in the creek. For turbidity, you'll notice that there's not an upper or lower threshold. That's generally harder to calculate, and also changes over time with changes in runoff. During periods of high spring runoff, snowmelt, you'll have higher turbidity compared to later in the season when there's less runoff and snowmelt. And so for this, there's not really a threshold associated with it. So we're looking more for the patterns in differences between different sites or dates of data collection. But here, the same idea, we have the cheat sheet of the y-axis, cloudier water versus clearer water. And then you would fill in the value, the class average on these lines. Next, we have nitrate, which also does not have an associated exact threshold. But if you kind of started to get into this higher range on the y-axis, that might be a cause for concern. And this is also in parts per million units. And so here, y-axis, we'd have more nitrate in the water versus less nitrate. And then we'd fill in our upstream data versus downstream data, draw a bar over the associated location. Next, we have pH, and pH has both an upper threshold and a lower threshold. So in this case, this is kind of where that chocolate bar analogy comes into play. We want to be between those 2 thresholds. So we want to be above 6.5, but below 9. And so depending on where students land, you can talk through what that might mean. So if you're below the lower threshold, the water is too acidic. If you're above the upper threshold, the water is too basic. So we're talking through those different components for the class averages that you came up with. Um, and then we talk about what that means. In some classes, if it might be easiest to go through one at a time. So say, what did we find? And then what does that mean? It could also be easier depending on kind of classroom dynamics to go through all of the graphs first and draw the data, write down the data, and then talk about all of what that means together. Um, Here you can remind students of what each indicator tells us about. So if we found really high levels of nitrate, what could that mean? Um, and based on the introductory lessons, students might be able to say, oh, we know that the river or creek went through a lot of agricultural areas. And so if we had really high nitrate, that might mean that we had a lot of agricultural runoff into our water supply. If we find really low or rather high turbidity, can think about the time of year. Okay, is it during spring runoff, during high flows? If it's during high flows, that might mean that the water is just cloudy at that period in time. And to make sure that there's not kind of a long-lasting persistent issue, we might want to measure turbidity again later in the season. And so that's an opportunity to talk about kind of long-term data collection and why we do long-term monitoring. If we find a really acidic pH, that might tell us that there are pollutants similar to the kind of fertilizer idea getting into the water. And then similar to turbidity, if we find, thinking about the timing of data collection, if we find really low dissolved oxygen, is it because it's kind of during a time where there's really low flow, so we don't have a lot of those ripples creating increased dissolved oxygen in the water? Or is it because, the structure of the creek is only providing the ability for water to move really slowly? So would we want to put in rocks or kind of waterfall-like features to increase the amount of dissolved oxygen in the water? And then, once we kind of think about what the results tell us, we'll think about how that might change as we move either further downstream or further upstream. So, um, it's kind of easiest in a lot of cases for students to think about the relationship downstream. So, as we move through more communities, through more of the built environment, um, what are some of the ways that we think that these results will change? So a lot of students, will say, I think that there will be more acidic water because there's more pollutants, or more nitrate because there's more pollutant, kind of uh, the pollutants are more likely to get into the water as it goes downstream for longer periods of time. And so this is another moment to kind of remind students of what their hypotheses were from the hypothesis worksheet during the data collection day. And in this case, a really great way to kind of discuss this is in those small groups. So this is kind of a great opportunity to move away from that large group discussion into small groups with a couple examples at the beginning, like I just shared, to just help students start off the conversation. Next, we developed some questions that we could ask either the classroom or school. So this is only if you're doing the data share day. But, students sometimes have a hard time thinking about what to talk about with other classroom or school. And so this is an opportunity to talk with students about some questions that they could ask to understand where there might be differences in results between what they found and what the other school or class found. And so some examples of that could be, what did the creek or river that you sampled look like? So, like we've talked about before, turbidity, is that measure of how clear the water is. Was the water moving really fast? Did it look like it was during spring runoff? Was it moving really slow, but still really cloudy? Did the creek have a lot of fast moving water, or was it only slow moving water? What could that tell us about the dissolved oxygen? So kind of helping students think about those questions that help us understand what the data are telling us about the water quality of that creek. Um, Next, we talk about what we can do as community members, as stewards uh, of our watersheds. What can we do to improve water quality? And so um, this can be really based off of the actual data that you collected, um, and or it can be related to kind of hypotheticals. So if we found a lot of nitrate in the water, what's an opportunity? What could we do about that? Um, and in that case, I think that's a great opportunity to kind of talk about land use trade-offs. So say, we need food to survive, right? We need our agricultural producers to continue to create, to grow our food. So we don't want to say, don't grow any more food, right? So how can we work with the agricultural community to kind of decrease the amount of fertilizer that's being used while still providing benefits so that they can grow lots of food for us to eat? There's no bad or good side here. We just want to find a medium where we can kind of balance those trade-offs of more food production while not causing water pollution. Um, Similar idea with pH regarding pollution. Um, and if we found really high turbidity, we can add places where water has the chance to slow down and settle out sediment. In this case, I talk a lot about, a snow globe idea. So when you shake up the snow globe, the water's moving really quickly. All the little snow particles are hanging in the water. When we stop shaking the snow globe and the water becomes calm and settled, that sediment, in this case, or the snow, filters to the bottom. And so that's an opportunity to talk about things like beaver dams and beaver dam analogs. Where can we create these structures, these areas where water can slow down and that sediment can kind of settle to the bottom? If we found low dissolved oxygen, how might we add more riffles and rapids and ripples into the creek? So where can we put in maybe rocks or waterfall structures to do that? And trying to have students come up with these ideas, but these are kind of some of the ideas that we've heard before, and just ideas to kind of pull from if students are having a hard time coming up with those ideas themselves. Um, and then next, if you're doing the data share day, remind them that you're doing so. If not, another optional activity either after this class on a different day or during this class would be to kind of take some of those ideas that they came up with for how they could improve water quality locally, and writing a letter to a community leader, maybe to your county commissioners. Some towns have an ecology board, and writing to them about their ideas for how they could improve water quality. And I will see you in the next video to talk about the data share day. Thank you so much.